we continue our study, the lesson on trials and execution of Jesus, let's go to the Lord and just, we know He's here. This is where He's placed His name for us. But we need to prepare ourselves to hear what the Holy Spirit wants to say to us this morning. So, Father, it's good. It is good to be in your house. It's good, Lord, to come together with those of like faith. And Lord, as we are gathered this morning to look into this topic, we look to you to open our understanding. Lord, you've got something different for each one of us. Help us to recognize that and to be individually open to what you have to say to us. Help us to be open in our hearts and receptive in our minds, Lord, to what you have to say this morning. And we just give this time into your hands, and we thank you for it. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Well, let's do our reading assignments here. Grady, would you actually just take the first two? There, John 18. We got two sections there. And then, Pastor, do you have your...
My Amplified and the other?
Yeah. Jack, I'm going to go to Jack. Jack, good morning.
Good morning.
Would you take this section in Matthew 26, please? Now, we're going to do that in sections, and I don't have it broken down up here. We're going to read a couple, 3 verses, talk about it, read a couple, 3 more on Matthew 26, 57 through 68. And then, Pastor, if you would take Leviticus 24 then with the Amplified. Eric, how about you doing Matthew 27, if you would, please. And then, Judy, if you would do Deuteronomy 21, and Janice, if you'll do Luke 23, please. Okay? And please remember what I asked you to read, because I didn't go it and say, anyway. Okay, you took notes, right, Giselle? Good for you. All right. If anybody hesitates, okay. So, trials and execution of Jesus. Continuing with that, now I didn't get quite finished. Last week I had an insert, a little more context. I told you that I had an opportunity to learn about Roman law and Roman Empire government. And I pretty much covered everything because we were talking about why and from John 11, when the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council. We're talking about why did they come together? Because they've been different ones wanting to kill Jesus for some time. So, test. Why? Why were they unified at this point in time? Because they were in agreement about a certain thing. Anybody remember what that was? Oh, them deer in the headlight looks. Come on, folks.
Well, I believe it was because they all came together so they could get rid of Jesus.
What brought them together? Because different ones, but what unified them? They finally were looking at it as a group. You had some here, some there. Remember last week, in fact, maybe we need to just go over this again. Last week in John 11, verse 47 through 50, Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council. Basically, they convened the Sanhedrin. And they were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and this is what the people are saying, the ones that came together. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. That's what unified them. That's what brought them together. They had their individual reasons before this, things that had, well, we can't put up with this anymore, so we need to kill him. But this is what brought them together. We will lose, the Romans will take away our place and our nation. A very reasonable concern. That's what we talked about last week. They'll take away our place and our nation. We talked about why they could do that and why it was a real threat. Excuse me. And just a brief recap here, then we'll go to Jesus before the priest. We come to the issue that unified them. By Roman policy, the Jews were still in charge in civil and religious matters. Maybe we talked about that last week, that Roman policy was you put your people in charge over the whole province. In this case, the Pilate was governor over Judea and Samaria. But you leave the local people in charge at the local level. In charge, if they've got their gods, let them worship them. If they've got certain civil laws and stuff, leave them alone. As long as it doesn't conflict with Roman law. So it's very not lax, but permissive on that. The usual religious and civil regulations were not affected. Now, the chief priest and the Pharisees, their concern was that Jesus, with his large following and his talk of a kingdom, what did Jesus preach? He preached the kingdom of God. It says, in all three synoptic gospels, he preached the kingdom of God. Then he had a lot of people, 5,000 for dinner, 3,000. He got a lot of people out there following him. So they've got a concern here because this large following and talk of a kingdom could prompt Pilate as governor to take measures to prevent any rebellion. We'll get into more rebellion stuff later. In fact, if you want a little teaser, look up we know that Barabbas it says in some of the translations that he was a robber, criminal. He was actually a rebel, a revolutionary. Look up what his name means in the Hebrew. It's really, really interesting. Anyway, back to this. What Pilate had the authority to do was to put his own people in. The council, the Sanhedrin, the priests in the Sanhedrin ruled Judea completely. The civil law, the religious law. They were still in charge just like always, except a couple things had been imposed, like capital punishment was taken away from them. But other than that, but see, if this thing with Jesus got too big, got to rolling too much, Pilate could see it as another rebellion, because remember the Maccabees was about 50 years before this, when they literally defeated the Roman armies in the area. And they were actually independent for a short time. They had to send more troops from Rome to put them down again. So anyway, their idea, they could take away our place. Well, these are the priests and the elders. They would lose their position. It would be Roman sympathizers, maybe even people from Rome or some of the officers would be put in their place. Now at this time, you want to keep in mind too, at this time, Caiaphas, and we'll get to that right down here, Caiaphas is spoken of as the high priest. He was appointed by Pilate, or it came from Rome. I don't know which. But he was appointed. He was not the hereditary high priest. Fortunately for Annas, Annas was the hereditary high priest, but he got he upset the Romans enough that they took him away from being high priest. So you see, they've got a real reason here to take away our place in our nation. It's already happened with Annas. They replaced him. I think there was somebody in between them, but they replaced him with Caiaphas at the time that we're reading about in John. So this is a very real possibility. That's what united them. So when Caiaphas said, it's better for one man to die and the whole nation not perish, he had a valid point there. Okay, so chief priests and elders were unified. They had a purpose. Now they had other things going on here too, but that was the thing that really brought them all together and got them acting together. Now, as we start looking at the trials, I want you to keep in mind what we just talked about. Why were they all together? Why were they all on the same page, if you would? It's because of that. So, Jesus before the priest. We start out with John 18, 12 through 14, if you would, please.
So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people.
Thank you. And some comments on this. And I'm sorry, I lost what you said in the first part of verse 12. You said soldiers, right? And their commander?
Yeah, soldiers and the captain.
Soldiers and the captain. Okay.
And the captain.
Thank you. Because I wanted to talk about that for a minute. There's a lot of things going on here, and this the soldiers and the captain. If you look in some of the other Gospels, you'll find out that it says that the priest gave men to Judas to go arrest him. And we talked about why Judas was involved, because they were afraid of the people. They needed a time and a place to arrest him. But here's what's really interesting. The Roman, my translation says Roman cohort and the commander, or in your translation, captain. That word there is Kiliarchos. Kiliarchos is a technical term for a certain rank. It is the rank of the commander of 1,000 soldiers, be equivalent to the Army's colonel. We're not talking a sergeant leading these people, or a first lieutenant, or even a captain. We're talking a colonel. Where did they come from? That, in some commentaries, there's speculation about it. But here's what we know. As we read through the whole account in John, as we look at the other accounts, Pilate didn't have anything to do with this. He didn't have anything to do with the arrest of Jesus. It doesn't specifically say that, but you look at how it's laid out, he didn't. He had nothing to do with that. In fact, we find out he got very, very frightened in his interview, his questioning Jesus. Now, Pilate was the commander of all Roman forces in the province and the province consisted of Judea and Samaria. Kind of interesting where these soldiers come from, particularly with that high commanding officer. Excuse me. Okay. In John 18, verse 3, that been earlier, it says that Judas received the cohort and officers from the Jews. So there must have been a little bit more interaction between the Jews and the Romans outside of Pilate's knowledge. Excuse me. Okay. So now look what it says there. Verse 13, they led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest. Now you notice that? High priest that year. Now, that doesn't sound like a hereditary deal, does it? So the actual background is Annas was high priest from AD 6 to AD 15 when he was removed from office by the Romans. Like I mentioned a little earlier, their concern here, they'd already had the high priest replaced. Okay, now the high priest was set up to be for life, so likely most Jews saw Annas still as high priest. It's kind of like if the government in some countries saying it, okay, this is the church, this is the official church. If you got some other stuff going on, forget it. You want to go to church, you come to this one. It's happened in Albania and some other countries. That's kind of the situation we're looking at. So listen to what it goes on to say in John 18, verses 19 through 24, if you would, please.
Then the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I have said to them. They know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Thank you. Now you notice in that whole section, we got two high priests. He's there with Annas, the high priest. And then they're sending him to Caiaphas, the high priest. And we know from the Old Testament, there's only one high priest. And again, we're seeing Caiaphas is the one that was put in place by Rome. Now, whether Pilate didn't do it because Pilate wasn't governor at the time Caiaphas became high priest. But some Roman officials, somehow, they replaced him with Caiaphas. Excuse me. Now, Caiaphas is obviously pro-Roman, or they wouldn't have put him in there. Okay. So, we got two high priests. Now, they took him to Annas first. And remember, the chief priest and the Pharisees, they convened a council, which was the Sanhedrin, which is the civil governing body, excuse me, civil and religious, excuse me. because I personally believe they took him to Annas first because that's who they saw as being the legitimate high priest. But Annas didn't have a lot of clout. Since Caiaphas was put in place, Caiaphas is the one that had to interact with Pilate. So they've got they're making their plans. They're setting things up here. Now, I said that Annas was high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. Caiaphas was appointed high priest in AD 18, and he's held that position to AD 37. AD 37. Okay. For some reason, not sure why my mind went to this. Kind of capricious sometimes. But what happened in AD 40? That's a date that should be really real to you. What happened in AD 40? Huh?
Remind us.
That's, or I said AD 40. I apologize. AD 70 is what I meant. I'm sorry. I don't know where 40 came from. I apologize. I was thinking that he was out before, but the temple didn't go down until AD 70. That must be where the 40 came from. Anyway, he was in position there 19 years, it looks like. Okay, now as I mentioned, Caiaphas actually is the one that made the decisions. Now, Jesus, the interview with Annas, that was his first trial. Remember, now this all happened at night, that it was after, they left Jerusalem, they left the temple, went up into the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where he was arrested, and it was nighttime. Remember, the disciples were so tired they couldn't keep their eyes open. I want you to keep that in the background as we look at the different things going on. Annas expected the soldiers and the word officers there of the Jews, that's really servants is the actual Greek word used there. They were probably officers in the temple guard or something like that, but servants is the typical word used. So we're talking nighttime, and a lot of stuff really gets crammed into this night. So, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Now, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, the Jews were plotting to kill Jesus, and they knew of his betrayal. The Jews were waiting for Jesus to be brought to them. That's why I emphasize that about nighttime. Now, and we read this next section that we're coming up on Jack, I believe it is. We're going to read sections. Okay. The first, Jack, if you'll read 57 through 61, please.
Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards who seated the outside. The chief priest and those of the Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus, so they could put him to death. But they did not find any. So many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Thank you. Now we'll go on from there in a jiff, but some comments here. They took him to Caiaphas, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. And it says in one of the Gospels that they had convened the council, the Sanhedrin. And again,
we're talking pretty late in the night by this point. He's already been to Annas. Now he's been sent over to Caiaphas, and they've got the group together. They're waiting on him. This isn't spontaneous. They're waiting on him. And in verse 59 there, they kept trying to obtain false testimony, but they didn't find it. And one of the other Gospels talks about how different ones had different stories, but they didn't agree. Yes, Jack?
Chris, when I read this, it said they're looking for false evidence.
Right.
Not evidence, but false evidence.
Exactly.
Why would they do that?
Because they didn't find any real evidence. Remember, now this is at the time of Passover. Jesus has already made the triumphant entry into Jerusalem at this point in time. So, remember, before this, they would question him at different times when he was in Jerusalem. He'd be at the temple, and the Pharisees or the scribes would ask him particular questions. Well, the idea there was they were trying to catch him in false statement about the Torah. Put the Torah, like when they went and said, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? You remember, he asked him for a coin and said, now whose face is on this? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's. That's one of the testings. They could never trip him up. So that's why they were at this point. They just, if they could have caught him like that out at the temple, and he just said, something about, well, no, you shouldn't be, doing anything with Caesar. We're Jews, Oh, they'd have had him. They'd have had him big time. But they never tripped him up. He never said anything that was at odds with the Torah or, and this is important, or with the traditions of the elders, in other words, with the Talmud. Everything he did was strictly in line with that, not just the Torah. But even how he celebrated the Passover with the disciples was as it was laid out in the Talmud. In other words, bang, bang, bang. He's got it down pat. But that's why they were looking for the false testimony. And at one, and again, I've looked at several of these, and I unfortunately don't remember which gospel said what at this point. But the idea was they couldn't get their false witnesses to agree. It said, I don't know if it's Matthew, I don't know which one it is. But, well, not Matthew, because that's what we're in here, but one of the others says that. The thing is, now they got two, verse 60, later on, two came forward and said, all right, that's important because by the law, again, they're trying to keep this legal. They are, this is the Sanhedrin, the priest. They're trying to do it by the letter of the law. Now, obviously false witness isn't, but everything they can keep together. You can't put according to the law, you can't put a person to death. Excuse me, back up. The council, the Sanhedrin, was their civil, they enacted their civil law. So you stole, this is what the Torah says, the Bible, the Old Testament, the law of Moses says, so this is what's going to happen to you. Okay, they enforced that. Under that, the Old Testament, the law of Moses, a person could not be put to death except on two or more witnesses. Okay? See the significance here, like that other gospel where they couldn't get their stories straight? Okay? They couldn't get two witnesses, until this happened here. So you can see how this is getting kind of drawn out. And they're having trouble with it. They can't get two people to lie, get their story straight. It's also, and this isn't brought out here, but something in addition in the Old Testament, the Torah, the law of Moses, could be put to death only on the testimony of two witnesses. And again, we're talking Sanhedrin, so this is their court, their civil court. The two witnesses had to be the first ones involved in the execution. Okay? If they're going to stone they take them out to be stoned, the two witnesses have to throw the first stones. They're going to hang them, the two witnesses have to be part of the hanging. Actually, not hanging, they didn't hang them. They had, the sword, or there's other things they did, kind of nasty, but the witnesses had to participate in that, which might be one reason they had a little trouble getting the witnesses. But that, again, that's part of the law of Moses. Okay, so they got these two. Later it says, two came forward and said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, we'll go on with verse 62 through 64. Now, I want you to listen to what verse 63 says there. Go ahead. 62 through 64, please.
Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus refused to, but Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.
One more, please.
Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. So I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.
Thank you. Now, you notice he was quiet until the priest said, and my translation is a little different. My translation says, I adjure you by the living God, but your translation is a little better in a common English about under oath. Okay. And I adjure you, you put it under, that means to put under strict oath. So Jesus was kind of in a position where he didn't have a lot of choice here. Before God, are you this? And so he did answer. Now, in that situation, what did he do? He committed blasphemy. Go ahead, then 65 and through 67, please.
Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do you need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard this blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit on his face, struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?
Thank you. So, this thing with the false witnesses and so forth, when he put Jesus under oath before God, they had the blasphemy. And blasphemy is very definitely worthy of death. And that was from the time of Moses, actually, that time forward. So now they have a legitimate religious reason right out of the Torah, and that's where a lot of their civil law comes from too. They've got both religious and civil law here. Jesus, he's going to die. By our law, he has to die because he blasphemed. Again, this is their perspective. We believe that he told the truth, that he is the Christ. They didn't see it that way, so from their perspective, boy, this is big time. And the thing is, like when he was on trial before Annas, he said at different times throughout his ministry that he was the Christ. You know, but they've got it now. You know, they've got the whole Sanhedrin, they've got it official. And again, we're down to the wire. This is happening in the middle of the night. The night before, or actually the night is the first part of the day of preparation for the Passover. Okay, so the Jews have witnesses. Now they've achieved their goal to find an acceptable reason. Now this reason is acceptable to the people. Remember they got Judas involved because they were afraid of the people. Now this is acceptable to the people. You know, we heard it. Hey, he blasphemed. He said he made himself to be the Son of God. You know, which was blasphemy from their perspective. So let's go to Leviticus 24 and see exactly what does God say about this.
And you shall say to the Israelites, whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. And he who blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him. The stranger, as well as he who was born in the land, shall be put to death when he blasphemes the name of the Lord.
Thank you. Now, stoning by the people. And there's a couple of things here I want to really bring out. Stoning is the prescribed method of execution. Now, the Jews were afraid of the people, so getting them to stone Jesus Christ would have been unlikely. You know, that triumphant entry, I mean, that was only the day before this is going on. So, getting them to stoning, and you notice it's, my translation here in verse 16, should surely be put to death, all the congregation shall stone him, is what second part of verse, or middle of verse 16 says. That word well, I'll come back to it. So, now stoning was practiced, I'm going into a little bit of a side note here. Stoning was practiced during this time by the people and the Jews. Now the Romans didn't pay much attention to it because, again, letting the local government take care of the local stuff, you know, because it didn't really matter to Rome. So, and particularly religious matters, blasphemy. Now, and later we'll see Pilate telling the Jews to handle this themselves. You guys take care of it. So I want to do a little side note here. I'm going to talk about the rebels' beating. Give a little bit of perspective what would typically happen here. A physical punishment administered by the people. This was by, I mentioned the Sanhedrin, and it was the elders. That was their civil law. They handed down judgments. The beatings, you know, I was beaten with the 40 stripes less one, Paul says. Okay, they handed down judgments. The people were involved, like here in Leviticus 24, all the congregation shall certainly stone him. A physical punishment administered by the people was called the rebels' beating. They had a name for it, the rebels' beating. There was no trial, no investigation, but it was given at the time of offense. And it was given to anyone in open defiance of an ordinance, whether it was law or tradition. Tradition of the elders. The rebels' beating was meant to be to the death of the offender. Okay, so rebels' beating. And we see throughout we see it in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament. During the time that we're talking about here, the trials and execution of Jesus. Now, in Leviticus there, all the congregation shall certainly stone him. The word congregation is the Hebrew word for company assembled together and acting together. In other words, this is going to be a group thing. They were instructed by God to punish certain sins as a group. And stoning is one of the punishments, and then there were other punishments there, but we're looking just at stoning at this point because blasphemy is what they're using against Jesus. Now, something I've wondered about, and perhaps you have too, the different times that they got together and either tried to kill Jesus or they killed some other people by stoning. There was never any mention of punishment or consequences, right? Because there wasn't. A rebel's beating, there was no consequences for it. And I'll mention some examples that'll kind of put this in perspective for you. Jesus, when he stood up to read at Nazareth in the synagogue, and he said this, read from Isaiah, "This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears." And then they got up, took him out to the edge. Nazareth was built up on a kind of a plateau type, and next to the town was the cliff. They took him out. Remember, they were going to push him off the cliff. That was a rebel's beating. Blasphemy. This day is fulfilled in your ears. Whoa, you can't go there. And so they were going to throw him off the cliff. Throwing off a cliff qualifies as stoning. How about the two attempts at the temple to stone Jesus? They picked up cobblestones and they were going to stone him. Stephen, he was stoned. He was stoned for blasphemy. So these things went on at that time. But remember, it was not a civil, it was not a court-ordered execution. This is something that people kind of, probably almost a mob type thing we would think of now. But that's Paul was stoned at Lystra and left for dead. But that's the type of thing that went on. And again, the Romans didn't pay any attention to it. So when you get down later to Jews telling Pilate, we don't have the authority to execute him, that's true because they were talking about a civil issue, not a kind of a mob type thing here. Okay. So, that's what a rebel's beating is. If this, I don't see any hands up, so I won't even ask you then, okay? I assume you feel free enough to interject. Let's talk about the Jews making plans. This takes us to Matthew 27, wherever we happen to be. Thank you.
When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they laid him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor.
Thank you. Now, this is interesting, very interesting. Now, when morning came, remember this has been going on throughout the night. The trials, Annas, Caiaphas? I'm not saying that right. Caiaphas. Thank you. That guy. And so now we're down to Jews making plans. They're still together. They've got him, they said they bound him and led him away, delivered him to Pilate. They said they plotted together. They plotted together to put him to death. Now, I want you to think about this. They've got him on blasphemy. They've got a good, legitimate reason. So what are they going to do with it? Because they can't kill him themselves. Going out, taking him up to the temple or someplace, and telling everybody throw rocks at this guy, that's not going to work. Because he is too popular. So what are they going to do? And that's what they're looking at now. They've got a common goal. They've got the blasphemy, so their conscience is clear. But how are we going to get him killed? The only option they have is to take him to Rome, to the Roman governor. Because the Roman governor had power of life and death. You know, Pilate told Jesus when he was doing the interview, or the trial there before, don't you know I have, you know, you're not saying anything. Don't you know I have the power, the authority to crucify you? Okay, that's why they brought Rome into the picture here. Because, okay, we want him dead. We can't do it. We don't have any options here. So we're going to take him to Pilate. We're going to let Rome execute him. Okay. So, you know, that's the option that they have. Anything they do as leaders in Judea has to be in line with the scriptures. Otherwise, their credibility with the people, which is a little iffy anyway, it's gone. So they've got to be by the book, so to speak. Now, this conference, this plotting, would be to decide the best manner of killing Jesus. The whole point here is, how are we going to make this happen? And we talked about already, stoning was not an option, a reasonable option. And having the Romans execute Jesus by crucifixion would resolve several issues. So that's what they pursued. You know, they got this council going, they're thinking it over, they're talking about this, that, having the Romans crucify him. Now, as we look at the context and the events that follow, notice how the Jews manipulate. I want to be real clear with that. As you read through here, look at how the Jews manipulate Pilate to get the crucifixion. I don't remember exactly, but it seems to me like there was 5 times that Pilate said, I find him innocent, and you still got crucified. Okay. So, now, a little bit of context on crucifixion. There's a lot of, some of the stuff, particularly in our culture, pretty distasteful. The crucifixion within Roman law was reserved for only one class. Now, we talked about that a week or 2 back, about the different classes in Rome, of the Romans. Like, remember Paul? They had him flogged, and he said, "You're doing this to a Roman citizen?" And I haven't even had a trial. Remember they came to get him out of jail? And he said, "I'm not going unless you apologize." Remember that? Okay. He was a natural-born Roman citizen. He had different status rights than other people. And again, there's, I don't know, 5, maybe 6 different degrees here. On the bottom are slaves. Okay? The way it worked was your social status had to do with the type of punishment you could receive. You could have, if you were a slave, or excuse me, let's say just a free person, and you committed a particular crime, all these things could be done to you. If you were a Roman citizen, committed the same crime, there were only a couple things they could do. Like even a Roman citizen for rebellion, the only punishment for a Roman citizen was exile. So again, you know, it makes a difference, the status here. Crucifixion was for only one class. You can probably guess which one it was. No, the slaves. Slaves. Yeah, being poor didn't help anything, but being a slave is the only one that could be crucified, except some of the lower classes could be crucified if they were guilty of rebellion. Remember I talked about how last week about the Roman Empire government and how the idea of being a Roman citizen fit into everything. Citizenship was big. So, at any rate, they, crucifixion, one crime and one class of people. So, if they have Jesus crucified, what does that picture him as? A slave, first off. Not a free man, not a free Judean going about his business. Pictured him as a slave. Also pictured him as a rebel. Which would be, the slave would really put him down in the Judeans, the Jewish people in their esteem, and the being a rebel would put him down as far as the Greeks and the Romans were concerned. So, as mentioned before, the intent of crucifixion was a deterrent to others, as well as a judgment, cruel judgment. And at this point, this time frame, Roman crucifixion had three policies. Crucifixion was done in a public manner and in a public place, usually along the road. Bodies were left on the cross to rot in place. Bodies were not removed for burial. In Judea, now that's, again, we get Paul over in Ephesus or in some of those places, then this would apply. But in Judea, they modified that some because, again, they're working with the local people, the local policies, the local laws. So they didn't enforce those policies in Judea, and maybe not in Samaria. I'm not sure about Samaria. So the Jews, and we'll wrap this up here, the Jews had a scriptural basis for wanting Jesus crucified, hanging on a tree. And one purpose was to discredit him to the people. So who has Deuteronomy 21? Please.
If a man is committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance.
Thank you. And that's pretty self-explanatory there. A couple of comments. A man is committed a sin worthy of death, he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree. You could not kill a person by hanging him, whether, noose or crucifixion or stuff. He had to be dead before you put him up for display. The only reason for hanging him on a tree is for display. Deterrent, whatever, shame the family. And so this is what modification the Romans did for the Jews. That's why when they said, we don't want them on the cross overnight, so break their legs and so forth and get them down. Okay. And that's why when they said the people passing by mocked him. Again, the crucifixion happens in a public place, typically along the road. Most places, they had the posts, the upright posts were in place in the place of execution. Particular road or whatever, that was typical. And then the criminal would carry the cross piece out to where they were going to be executed. In Judea, it looks like, and there's a lot of, we can go to the internet and find a plethora of ideas out there. In Judea, it would appear that they didn't leave the post up, partly because the Judeans, the Jewish idea of ceremonially unclean, if you touch a dead body. Remember about the whitewashed sepulchres? We talked about that, how those graves out in the fields all had to be whitewashed before Passover, right? So nobody got defiled. Well, you're not going to want something like this along a major road, because you're just passing by, you're within a certain number of feet, you're going to be defiled. So likely they took them down, put them back up, just for what that's worth. Okay, we'll pick up there next week with Jesus before the governors. Thank you.